This is I don't know what episode we're on right now, but this is an episode of the podcast We Made This Political with Laura Borkham and myself, Laura. And today we're joined by our guest, Shannon Watson of Majority in the Middle. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.
So just to start off with our intros, I'm Laura Borkham, president of the Independent Center, a consumer psychology PhD, and a former marketing professor. I'm Lauren Hall. I'm a professor of political science and the author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. And this is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power. So we talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens. And we're drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and also as parents and as children of parents, thinking about the really broad swath of how political decisions are made and how we craft our political identities. Welcome. And we're joined today by Shannon, who is the founder and executive director of Majority in the Middle. Shannon has a wealth of experience in policy roles and public affairs roles, but also in campaigns in Kansas, Colorado, and Minnesota. But I know that Majority in the Middle's work is focused in Minnesota. So we're interested to hear all about, tell us about Majority in the Middle and what you do and what led you to start it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the invitation. Good to see you guys. So Majority in the Middle is a nonprofit. It's a 501c3, which means that we're on the charity side. So we do a lot of civic education. We do a lot of advocacy. We technically could do lobbying, but we don't. That's been a sort of strategic decision, but we can't get involved in campaign. So that's our boundary line. But one of the things that we are trying to do is we have 3 buckets. The first is making a space, and sometimes that's a physical space, sometimes it's a metaphorical space for people who feel like they're in the middle to engage in political conversation or political action. And we let people define what middle means to them. For some people, it means they are on the left or on the right, but they're moderate. So they feel like, okay, I'm in the middle. Some people, like myself, full disclosure, have some views from the right and some views from the left. And so I'm not on anybody's team. I'm on everybody's team. So that makes me in the middle. And then there are people, and these were the most surprising to me, the people who were coming to us were people who are very entrenched in their values, either the right or the left, but they believe that governing, not necessarily campaigning, but governing is about finding the compromise, finding the collaboration, the middle ground. And so that sort of brings them in. So we do that. We do some civic education, trying to demystify government, state capitals, and legislative bodies. They're intimidating, and they have their own language and their own customs, and you don't necessarily know what the deal is. And so it's really hard for people to participate when they don't know. And so we do some demystification of government. And then we also look at the structure that gets in the way, the things that divide us and keep us divided. At the legislative level, we talk about a lot of structural partisanship, which I imagine we'll touch on later. But then also just like at the local nonpartisan level, like what do we do to keep local offices nonpartisan that are supposed to be? So those are the things we do. We got a lot of different sort of things on our plate.
Awesome. How did you get interested in politics? Like, what have you held specific political roles, or like what kind of got you into this messy world in the first place?
That's a really good question. I was involved, like when I was in school, in middle school and high school, like I would run for student council. I don't think I ever won. I was in college before I ever ran for office and was elected by my peers, which I appreciated. But my parents, they were both in politically adjacent jobs as I was growing up. My dad was in law enforcement. He was the deputy chief of police when I was in high school, which made me super popular, as you can imagine. And my mom was in media. She was a freelance journalist. And then she had a women's focused publication in the 90s when some of those were starting to spin up. So very politically adjacent jobs, not in elected roles. But so politics has never been a thing that was weird or out of reach or whatever. There were always politicians in their professional social circles. So that wasn't ever unusual to me. And it just a part of what you do as a citizen to participate with your government.
It sounds like it's really interesting you point out their roles because it seems like both of them had a really strong incentive to be nonpartisan or bipartisan, depending on
Eh,
how you want to define those, and that incentive can be really important. And it's uncommon, right? Because I think there are a lot of
Yeah,
cultural incentives increasingly so that make people
very
feel like
much.
they need to pick a side. But your parents' job specifically, they felt like required them to not take a side.
And my parent, their political backgrounds or their sort of ideologies are very different. So my dad is what I have started calling a legacy Republican. He's been a
Okay.
Republican for a very long time, not super happy with the current status of his party. Like his family has very strong military tradition. He was in law enforcement, very much market-based solutions and bootstraps and lots of those things. My mom, she grew up in rural Kansas and she is a Democrat or a libertarian, depending on the day and the issue. And I think some of that comes from the Kansans were all, I don't know how much familiarity you all have with Kansas, but there's a libertarian streak that runs through both parties.
Okay.
So even the conservatives in Kansas are not all like necessarily evangelical conservatives. They're more libertarian conservatives. And there is a place for government, but there's an agreement that maybe not every place is a place for government.
Okay.
Sometimes I joke with my mom, she's so far left, she like wrapped around the other side.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Horseshoe. Yeah. What is the matter with Kansas? We have a question from the audience. Or that's in quotes, so maybe it's
Yes. And there was a book, late 80s, early 90s, maybe. It feels like it's old to me, so it's probably about that time. Yes, and that was talking about and the book at the time, it didn't really seem that controversial. I think it has become controversial, and maybe just because we're all willing to be a little more antagonistic in our political discourse. But the sort of theme was why are all these Kansans voting against their own self-interest? Why is there so much republicanism in anti-government? And again, I do think it is that libertarian streak in the same way that Kansas was the first constitutional amendment issue about abortion access after Dobbs.
Right.
And I don't know if, because that was quite a while ago. And it was defeated. There were a lot of national commentators at the time who were like, wow, that really goes to show that even, conservatives are crossing over and supporting choice rights. And again, it's that sort of libertarian streak. Even the Democrats are like, yeah, no, we don't want government in those healthcare decisions. So so it's really interesting to look back at the impact that book had and see if it's still actually relevant today.
Yeah. So my parents were very similar in the sense that they were ideologically quite different.
Cool.
My dad was a conservative libertarian Zen Buddhist, which like adds this whole element of
Interesting.
complicated. What is happening here? And hilariously, like I know that there's one other libertarian conservative Zen Buddhist because he was a member of our Zen center growing up. So like I knew two of them, which is like a very weird network. And then my mom was like a pretty standard independent. I think a lot of the work that Laura does is like very much, but she was probably like Blue Dog Democrat, but has definitely split tickets her whole life. But one of the things that concerns me about our modern sort of situation is the growing rate of assortative mating and the fact that more and more people are not marrying people who have politically divergent views. It used to be more common for people to marry across political lines than it was across religious lines. And now it's much, much more common for people to marry across religious lines than it is political lines. I don't know if you're seeing any of that in like the work of Majority in the Middle, but it seems like stories like yours and mine of growing up in ideologically diverse household is something that's not, and I think about this a lot when I'm parenting my own kids. We want our kids to hear people disagree civilly about political issues. And I feel like those spaces, especially because the household is not that place anymore, like we've lost those. So you see any of this in like your research or how Majority in the Middle is thinking about that dynamic? But it's a really interesting one. And I don't know what you do about mating choice. Like that's don't want to start, despite the Trump administration comments to the contrary. I don't believe that government should be directing people on mate choice or how many children to have.
Yes. Yeah. 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 That idea that you can't be in relationship with somebody who votes differently than you do is so foreign to me. And that was like, That's a weird concept, again, because that's the way I grew up and that's the environment where you can disagree with somebody on an issue, but you're still in relationship with them. You still love them. You still appreciate other things about them. It is not like the number one major thing that dictates everything else. And so I think as we are using language, and I've done political stuff and campaign stuff for a long time. I'm retired from campaigns, but I did it for about 20 years. The language that we use to motivate people, particularly with fear and anger, and distilling down who you vote for to this 100% yes or no a description of, morality, and making everything like a moral choice. When I don't necessarily think it has to be, that's very motivating. If you're trying to get voters to do something, give money, donate, show up, GOTV, all the things, it's very motivating. And it's also completely destabilizing to trying to have relationship with people. And so there's been some really interesting research about people who are like super political on social media and how when you double down on those issues, there's some research about how when you espouse a lot of political stuff and when you're coached in that morality language, it doesn't actually do anything to change your audience's perception of the issue, but it reinforces, it puts you in your own echo chamber and makes you double down on what you think, which I think is really interesting because none of us, I think, are putting stuff out on social media with the idea that we're just trying to reinforce our own selves in those positions. So that's the thing. Like when we are less likely to have those conversations and have those relationships where you understand that, yeah, you and I don't agree on that issue, but we're still in relationship. We still love each other. We still appreciate other things. Then yeah, it makes it super difficult to expose people to those kind of issues.
Yeah. This self-reinforcing idea is really well known in psychology, that we understand our attitudes through our behaviors. So we tend to think that attitudes drive behaviors, but behaviors also reinforce attitudes. And so if you couple that with the fact that in a wide range of areas, especially religion and politics, trying to persuade people to change their minds or trying to persuade them that their views are wrong actually makes them double down on their original viewpoint. If you combine those two things, I feel like it's hard to argue that you're doing anything effective by sharing political views on social media.
Yes. Yeah. And then of course you add in the algorithms that deliver to our eyeballs more content that we interact with and that we like. I think that's challenging as well, because then you don't stumble upon somebody else's opposite thoughts or perspectives. Yeah, that was one of the things. So we put Majority in the Middle together at the end of 2020. And I had an opportunity earlier that year to put pen to paper and articulate some of my own values. What is it that I really care about? And I care very deeply about how people experience politics, not necessarily how people vote, not necessarily getting one party into office or another, or no particular issues, but I care about how people experience politics in this country and how do you feel like it's fair? Because that's the thing. Like if you feel like it's fair, then no matter the outcome, then you can accept that. If you feel like there's a space for you to participate, then you will. I used to work with a lot of first-time candidates, and most first-time candidates by a large margin, first-time candidates generally lose their races, mainly because they are often up against incumbents, but first-time candidates almost always lose. And it's not necessarily like their fault or anything that they're doing wrong or any shortcomings they had. It's like running. There's the organization Couch to 5K, you got to take some steps and you got to learn what you're going to learn along the way. And so I used to coach candidates. If you want to run for office, you need to run when you expect not to win. Then got to be your first race, because that's going to be your test case and your learning and whatever. The challenge and this was early 2000s, there were a lot of first-time candidates and they were having a really bad experience running and losing. You don't necessarily have to have a bad campaign experience if the outcome is losing. But the thing that was most concerning to me, if you have a really bad experience, number one, you're less likely to try to run again. and put those experiences that learning to use. The second thing is most first-time candidates are surrounded by first-time supporters and first-time volunteers and donors. And so if they have a bad experience, then they are less likely to try again or participate again. And then it perpetuates this idea that campaigns and politics is rigged. It's only for certain people. Normal people don't have the ability to compete in these arenas. And so all of that sort of came to a head at the end of 2020, which I will say, like, that presidential election got ugly in a way that I think actually had a lot to do with COVID, and not necessarily like the politicization of COVID itself. But if you think back to that time, we didn't really have any other healthy competition. Like 2020, that's when all the sports were getting canceled and you could watch the NFL on TV. The only competition that we had was that presidential election that we were all experiencing. And so we didn't have the healthy rivalries. We just had this thing. And so I was watching, so it was the first debate between then President Trump and candidate Biden. And I didn't actually watch the debate itself. I didn't need to. It wasn't going to change my experience. But I watched social media afterwards, and I saw a lot of people on the left doubling down. Not necessarily that Biden was great, but that Trump was terrible. Saw a lot of people on the right that were doubling down. Not necessarily that Trump was great, but Biden was terrible. And then I saw a lot of people who I consider to be very political people. So they've served in office, or they've been staff, they've worked on campaigns, they are active in their local political parties. A lot of them were like, this is gross, I'm out. And so at that point, I was like, okay, we have reached a tipping point, because I don't actually believe that we're further and further apart. I believe that as the voices on either end of the spectrum get louder, that makes us seem like we're further apart. And the reason that they're getting louder is not necessarily because they're loud, but because the opposite bell curve in the middle has dropped out. And so people who are in the middle of political conversation like that has fallen out. So even if those people who I consider to be very political people are opting out of the conversation, then I was like, okay, we've got to hit tipping point. I don't know how to fix this, but I have to try. So that's the origin story there.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's really interesting that and you and I have talked before, and what struck me about our conversation is that, I'm sorry, the cat.
Hi, Kitty.
I don't have a tail. I worry about what people think when a tail comes across the screen. So what you talked about is supporting and you don't use exactly these words, but I think of it as like supporting or attending to the emotional needs of people to participate in politics, especially people who are responding to different incentives, right? Because if you like power and money and screaming matches on social media, like, politics is giving you meeting all of your needs. But if you're a decent person, then those things don't really appeal to you. And I think we have to pay attention to what those people need in order to remain in political life and remain as elected officials. So I was really intrigued to hear you talk about all that work that you do to support people who are not after power and money and social media notoriety. Could you talk more about that? Yeah.
Sure. That's part of the thing is the collective we in the United States, we have made running for and serving in office awful experiences. So yeah, you do have to either enjoy the game, and the people who enjoy the game are my least favorite people on the planet, because I'm like, you are ruining this for other people. But like I said, I used to work for a lot of first-time candidates. I used to work for a lot of women candidates. And it used to be that women did not want to run when their kids were little, like early grade school and below, because they need mom to do a lot of stuff for them. And so it's really hard to juggle all of those things. Now, and within the last 10 years or so, that has shifted. Women seem to be a little more willing to run when their kids are little. They don't want to do it when their kids are in middle and high school, because of social media and the stuff that people post about their mom or their dad. Yeah. They post, and then because then the kids see that and they have that experience as well. So put all of the safety issues aside and protesting and just the sort of vitriol that we have allowed to be part of this system. So that's the thing. Like, how do we've been looking at, particularly in the legislature, Minnesota legislature, what we call the structural partisanship, which is some of its rules. It's almost never laws, but the rules, the customs, the physical infrastructure of our legislative bodies that divide people. So there's a Republican caucus and there's a DFL caucus. In Minnesota, the Democrats are DFL. It's the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Either term is fine. To get Republicans, you get Democrats. In the Senate, for the most part, when they do committees, they have a formula. So like the chair sits in the middle, and then the vice chairs over here and the ranking members on the other side. And then it's based on seniority. And so it goes back and forth. So you wind up having people of different political parties sitting next to each other. In the House of Representatives, they have these like U-shaped tables. So it's like this. And the Democrats sit on one side of the table and the Republicans sit on the other side of the table. And so like, sometimes you walk into the committee rooms and you get like an antagonistic vibe. It feels heavy. It feels you're gonna be in a fight. And that's partially because the infrastructure of where you sit at the table makes it antagonistic. And so that's the thing. Most people, when they get elected to a legislature, and when I say legislature, that could be the city council, that could be the school board, that could be the legislature, that could be Congress. We don't do any work with Congress yet because it's too big of an issue. We're starting at the state level. But like, how can we identify the things that people are like, okay, I want to run for office and serve my community and go to the state capitol and participate in these things. And then most of them get there and they're like, what is this? How can we support those people? Because that's the thing, because they usually have two choices. They either stick it out long enough to get some power to be able to do something about it. And by that time, they've become part of sort of the system and the way things are always done and whatever. Or, and these are the people that I'm super concerned about, they're like, I don't like this. I don't want to spend my time this way. I do not spend 4 months of the year wanting to fight with people. I'm out. I'm not running again. And can please, you are the people that I need in these legislative bodies. So we look at what can we do? And part of that comes from voters need to get involved in these conversations. Like polling will show most people and politicians will tell you, like, we go knock on the doors and they say, oh, everybody wants us to get along. Okay, why aren't you doing that? If 80% of citizens want the parties to get along and collaborate, why aren't you? And what can we do to amplify that? Elected officials have to live in an attention economy, whether we want to or not. And so one of the things that we do in Minnesota is use our platform, and I've got some PR background. So instead of saying, hey, Minnesota Star Tribune, do a story about majority in the middle, I actually never do that. Hey, there's two legislators over here from opposite parties and they're getting along and they're getting this thing done. Can you please do a story about that? Please elevate those things, because what winds up generally on the front page of the paper is the conflict. And in fairness, really good journalism has a bias towards conflict and a bias towards fairness. And those are things like that's part of journalism. You need to tell both sides of the story. But when, you've got two parties and there's inherent conflict, then that's the story you wind up telling. You're not telling the story of people who are getting along. Good news, this has been a little more successful recently because people of opposite parties getting along is newsy. It's worthy. It's worth a story in the paper. So that's the thing. Like, how can we, to your point about the incentives, and somebody told me I do gentle parenting. Like, I'm not a parent. Somebody told me I apply a gentle parenting approach to legislators in that I don't tell them, I don't walk around the Capitol saying, hey, can you guys not be so partisan? Can you get along? Because that's not good. They're just going to run away from me. They're not going to take a meeting. It's not going to change anything. But if we can uplift sort of the behavior we want to see and reward that for people who have to live in an attention economy, maybe that will change the behavior some. And then if their constituents can say, yes, we do want you to collaborate, like they're going through like awful budget negotiations right now, and nobody's happy because nobody's going to get what they want. And that's okay. That's exactly the process. Is they get a lot of hate mail from people who are unhappy. But so we tell people, like, if this is something you want to see, you need to send that email that says, you know what, this budget isn't exactly what I wanted, but I appreciate you collaborating. I appreciate you coming to a resolution, because that's the thing. Like, they will do more of what is rewarded. So that was a really long answer to that question. Sorry.
No, it was a great one though, and it like spun off 85 thoughts. So I'll try to.
Right.
When Laura and I were talking about starting this podcast, one of the things that I think we were both really interested in, and I think it comes from both of our backgrounds as both in terms of like consumer and social psychology, but then political theory, we were really interested in thinking about politics in terms of relationships as opposed to in terms of power. And part of this is thinking about, and I'm reminded, I used to teach a course on women in politics, and we read this book by Jennifer, I think it was Jennifer Lawless, called It Takes a Candidate. And she does this beautiful analysis of like why women do or do not run. And you're absolutely right that like originally it was like not wanting to be away from kids. But a lot of women did talk about this sort of like adversarial, like really ugly side of politics. And of course, now you would add in just like the 24-hour fundraising cycle like that.
Yes.
But one of the things that I would confront my students with is, yes, we do see a participation gap between men and women. But most men don't want to do this either. This isn't like a gendered thing. Like, politics is ugly for sort of everyone. And as we've moved toward this really hyper partisan, extremely antagonistic, but also the sort of 24-hour, 24/7 news cycle and fundraising cycle, more and more people are dropping out who would otherwise think about politics in terms of, I want to serve my community. So the servant
Public
leader
service.
kind of approach, like that's not happening anymore. And it's both, like, this isn't just like a male versus female thing. It's across the board. So
Yes.
I was really, the more that you were talking about that question, this actually goes back to the point you made earlier about thinking about what your value, like what are your values and what do you really see from this? One hopeful space that I've been thinking more about is how we prioritize or how we think intentionally about the stories that we're telling and what our responsibility is and I actually had to take a pause on my Substack after the election, the 2024 election, to just like take a step back and say, okay, how should I be contributing to this space? Because I could just add another like angsty voice into the void, or I can actually think really intentionally about what my values are and how I want them to appear in the world. And I think we're starting to see more of that, like the loose journalism. There's more people who are thinking really intentionally about, and so I think you're starting to see this in the media. You're starting to see this I actually don't know. We're seeing a little bit of it in universities, not as much as I would hope to see, given the distrust that Americans have of universities right now. So I guess I am feeling a little bit hopeful that people are starting to think more about this. But anyway, I think your work is just a really good example of that in practice, trying to really think about how to uplift the people, not by scolding people, but by prioritizing and intentionally thinking about the stories that we tell in the political world and the people that we give oxygen to, right?
Yes. And that's the thing. There was a news, I don't know if it was a Politico or something. It was in January, February, when this latest Congress was sworn in. There was somebody who had been, I wish I could remember exactly what his name was, but there was somebody who had been involved in a congressional role for a long time. And he said the challenge with Congress today is that the people who are getting the most airtime, the most quotes in social media and in legacy news organizations, they are the most institutionally irrelevant.
Oh.
And I was just like, ooh, man, I've been called a lot of names, but institutionally irrelevant would hit hard.
Yeah.
Because I would care about that kind of thing. But that's the thing. These are not the people, it's not the leadership. It's not the committee chairs. It's not the people who have the institutional power. It's the people who are really good at driving eyeballs and the attention economy and winding people up. And I don't like that. I watch really good. Okay, so I put people who run for office in two buckets right now. You're either a juror or you're an activist. And activists come to the role with their minds made up. They have an agenda that they want to achieve. this is just the next step in their activism to try to change something. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just like it's the other thing. And then there's people who are like jurors who look at it more like a public servant, but like service on a jury. And a role of a juror is to look at sort of the case presented, the evidence presented, to ask the questions, and then work with the other jurors to figure out like, what's the resolution to this? They don't necessarily come in with their minds made up. And so when you have those two groups of people who not only may feel, and that there are activists and jurors in both parties, in all parties. When you have activists who are trying to advance an agenda and you have jurors who are trying to like solve problems for the populace, those two can come to loggerheads very easily. And the activists generally fall more into the people who are good at the attention economy. But it's really the jurors who actually make the institutional difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a really interesting observation. The contrast between those two things. When people tell me how concerned they are about the extreme voices in Congress from either party, almost invariably they're fretting about somebody with views that are like limited to that person. And I'm like, it really doesn't matter what the views are of a single representative in the House. Like that,
Yes.
that those are very difficult to move into legislation. So it's fascinating. You're right. Like the sort of disproportionate extreme beliefs and like almost no
Yeah, which is interesting because when you're talking about people who are only influential because of the eyeballs and the narrative that they are driving, honestly, the best way to fight that is to ignore them. Don't amplify their stuff. It's all used to on Twitter, like when there's trolls with 6 followers. Yeah, the instinct is to respond to them when they like put something on my post or whatever. But I'm not adding eyeballs to your 6 people, like just shout at the rain over there. And so some of the difficulty of this work, and I'm sure that you two see this, is there's an attitude that if you're not actively fighting whatever or whoever their narrative, then you're not making a difference. You're not actually attacking the problem. You're enabling or you're naive. There were like 3 people called me naive in the last 2 weeks. And so it was really an interesting thing. And it was just like, you know what? It isn't naive to point at the good stuff, to talk about, yes, the Minnesota legislature, there was really an ugly floor fight over an issue. And it wasn't left versus right. It was left versus more left. Mm-hmm. And it was a really unusual thing because usually the caucus unity is something that's prized. And so those fights generally happen like behind closed doors. And particularly when talking about the Democratic Party right now, they have a challenge. They need to show that they have a big tent and how a big tent can deal with intra-party conflicts without saying, yes, you're 100% wrong and I'm 100% right. Like wrestling with those things. Like there was a really visible and public demonstration of, yep, these 2 people in this same caucus do not get along. And so like the idea that you're enabling or fighting if, you're not being productive, like focusing on the positive, focusing on what you want to see, drawing eyeballs only to that's a strategy. Mm-hmm. It's not a naivete. It's deliberate. Let's suck the oxygen out of the things that we don't want to see because that's what's fueling the fire. So that's just me being honestly more negative than I usually am in public.
It reminds me of Lauren's work, though, on radical moderation and why that was her framing of that, because I think it's the same sort of desire to counter the sense that like you're not stepping up, you're not being active, you're not doing what you should.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of consonance between both of your works in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that was actually going to be one of my questions. Laura does work with independent voters and they do work on political moderation and trying to help people frame a principled moderation, right? As opposed to just pick a point in the middle. And that's what we're calling moderation.
Right.
But I'm wondering, what do you see? Obviously independent voters are not always political moderates, and political moderates are always independent voters, but there's in the Venn diagram, there's at least overlap, right? So I'm wondering how you think about that. Specifically, your organization is called Majority in the Middle. And so how do you think about both independent voters, centrist, principled moderate voters? What do you see as the connections between the two? And then what do you think are the best ways of reaching both groups, including whatever overlap we see? That was a lot of questions. So take whichever one.
No, love it. I love it. One of the ways that, the people who are disaffected, Majority in the Middle in our name comes from all those people in the middle who have dropped out. Those are the hardest people to reach because, again, they have dropped out. They're like, I don't want to have this conversation. I want to live my life. I want to do my job. I want to take care of my kids. I don't want any of this nonsense. And so they are very hard to find. One of the ways that we, from the very start, we're talking about, hey, come to this space if you want to engage. And one of the things that we were telling people, we're not going to ask anybody, not only are we just welcoming of all sort of perspectives, but very deliberately saying, you're not going to have to justify or defend your position. Because some of those conversations are like, okay, this versus this. And why do you think that way? There's good ways to have those sort of left versus right conversations. Braver Angels is a great organization. They teach people how to do that from a marriage and family therapy basis. Actually, one of the founders of Braver Angels, he's from Minnesota, and he's a marriage and family therapy professor of 40 years. And so he's taking that framework and applying it to teaching people how to talk to each other, which is awesome. But so the idea that you're going to have to come into a space and defend your position is almost as off-putting as saying you're not welcome here. So there's that piece and you're not going to have to be combative with somebody and being very deliberate about that. I think when you're talking about the Venn diagram, I want to say, I can't remember if it was Pew or Gallup. And in 2022, I think that was the first year that more Americans identified as independents than as Democrats or Republicans. Now, most people who identify as independent, some of this may be from your website, actually. Most people, they have a lean. They generally vote this way or they vote this way, but they don't want to identify as a member of that party. To me, that's a brand problem for the major parties. If you have somebody who subscribes to your ideas, generally supports them and whatever, but doesn't want to be labeled with your particular brand, that's a brand problem. Right. What is that saying about your party or whatever? But so that's the thing. If there isn't room for nuance, if there isn't room for disagreement in our two parties, if it's, okay, you believe 100% of this and the people around you are going to say you believe 100% of this, that's one of the reasons that I distinguish between Trump Republicans and legacy Republicans, because I know a lot of moderate Republicans who've been unenthusiastically fleeing their party because they're like, no, I believe all of these things. That is not a good demonstration of what I believe. And that is carrying the party banner. So I'm not doing that. And so that part of the challenge is for the political parties, I don't necessarily feel like you have to be on the right or on the left 100% of the time. Like I said, I hold some views that are generally on the platform of the right and some that are generally on the platform of the left. And I think that's okay. But there are a lot of people who are like, nope, if you're not 100% with us, that means you're against us.
Yep. Yeah.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, this reminds me of that difference between sort of, I think we've moved into a space where politics is, especially partisanship, is really, there's such a focus on ideological purity tests. And this happens on both the right and the left, right? So a lot of people on the left, you had to be a specific kind of voter. You had to have very specific views. Often they were related to the culture wars and things that actually they motivated people, to your point early, but they didn't actually relate to the problems that people were facing in really tangible ways. And then, of course, on the right, we're seeing that now with sort of the MAGA movement as a huge ideological purity test, right? And one of the things that I think back to my dad, again, this conservative libertarian, but he would be more likely to vote Democratic in local elections and but he usually voted libertarian in national elections. But his position really it wasn't an ideological purity test position, even though he identified as a libertarian. But his position was, government is better at solving problems on the local level, right? He like read a lot of
Yeah.
Friedrich Hayek. And so his perspective, he actually wanted to empower his town officials to plow the streets in a
Yes.
timely manner and pick up the garbage, right? So he had no issues with like big government on the town level, but he did have a lot of concerns about big government at the national level. He
Mhm.
just lost that kind of nuance. Like, and part of the reason that I think he was able to be more flexible than like some conservatives or libertarians right now is that he was able to discern, I'm really about solving human problems. And so the
Yeah.
reason that he's a libertarian is not because he thinks like libertarians are like correct in some like platonic form or something like that. But he just thinks that generally speaking, libertarian policies solve problems better than other kinds of policies.
Right.
And but if you so from his perspective, the problem solving came first. Whereas I think what we're doing now is the ideology comes first, whether you're on the left or the right. And so the question is not like how do my specific political views line up with solving the problems we're facing? It's I have to smash all of the problems we're facing into my ideological
Yes.
view,
Yeah.
no matter what the outcome is. And that I think is profoundly damaging. And I don't know. I think a lot of this again comes down to like media being more careful about how they frame things. I think we have to give voice to more non-some kinds of approaches. But yeah, I think that the purity tests are obviously driving people away from partisan politics because all of the research on the Independent Center's webpage is demonstrating that people are fleeing this because they don't want to be held to these bizarre, arbitrary standards of what it means to be a Democrat or what it means to be a Republican right now. So
Yeah,
mild rant.
We actually have some research showing that if you look at the cohesiveness of views of the members of the two parties, they're actually lower, and people who are independents, who are nonpartisans, are more cohesive. And I think that's why they've dropped out, is because they don't like the purity testing. The purity testing is actually really absurd. Right? It's not a question of ideology, like which political philosophers do we read? It's like you would hear which don't have a lot of consistency. They don't have a lot of underlying consistency, right? They're just like, no, you need to be checked on all of our positions. So it's this odd contrast of there's very little room for disagreement. But the underlying thing shaping the beliefs is really inconsistent, right?
Yeah.
To me, I wonder if what's happened is that as the parties have gotten away from talking about the underlying values that shape their platforms, all you can really do is follow the leader of the party, right? And it's now Republicanism is whatever Donald Trump says it is, right? And Democratic views are the same way. We're trying to decide who the leader of the party is, so we'll know what it means to be a Democrat, right?
Yes.
So that's driving all these people to drop out, because the people who have very deeply considered beliefs are beliefs that are part of a cohesive worldview, right? Those are the ones who are like, this entire political conversation is absurd and I don't want any part of it. It's not satisfying. It's not connected to my values. And we see a lot of empirical evidence to support that.
Yeah, the cult of personality is, frankly, it's dangerous. And it's really destabilizing. If it's okay, what does this person think? Yeah, we have, it took us a long time to try to figure out like what should our work be about at the local level. Because in Minnesota, and this is not necessarily the same way in every state, but in Minnesota, all the local elected offices are legally nonpartisan. County commissioners, city councilors, mayors, school board, park and water board, hospital board, I think that's the list, county commissioners. Those are all legally nonpartisan. But there are still places where the partisanship does come into play. The political parties do endorsements and stuff. And then that seems to have a downstream effect of once people get elected, then the jurisdiction gets a little fuzzy and people try to do some mission creep. So there were a lot of city councils here who last year, early this year, were being asked by activist constituents to weigh in on the Hamas-Israel conflict and to send resolutions of whatever. City councils in Minnesota have no role in foreign policy, and they shouldn't. And the pushback is always, we have our constituents asking us to weigh in on this. And what I feel like, I had a conversation with a mayor several years ago, and his city was getting into some stuff that I thought was wasn't the role of the city. And I said, why are you pushing this agenda? And he said, when a constituent calls me and says, I have this problem, they are not interested in hearing me say, it's not my jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say the thing where you like talking to somebody and then an hour later, you're like, oh, I should have said that. I very rarely have that anymore. Thank God. But this is one of the times. And it took me a couple of years actually to figure out what I should have said in comeback to that. And what I should have said and what I do say now is they may not want to hear it. It is your responsibility to say it and point at the legislative or the governmental body for whom that is the appropriate thing.
Yeah.
Congress should be weighing in on foreign policy. The county here has the social services stuff. So if you have an issue with the social services, then you need to talk to your county commissioner and those kind of things. And because otherwise, when the partisan politics gets involved in the potholes, like there's no such thing as a partisan pothole. At least there shouldn't be. And then you get mission creep and you get all this expansion of things that aren't necessarily appropriate. And then citizens get disillusioned with what their government is supposed to do on each level and why they aren't doing it. Why did this resolution not end the war in Gaza?
I think actually local governments should take a hard lesson from universities. If you look at the drop in American trust in universities over the last 10 years, it has been dramatic. And I think it's very dangerous, right? So I think it's 30% of Americans trust universities, right? Trust higher education as an institution. It's very low. But part of the reason for that is that like universities got caught up in this idea that they had to make they had to make a statement. And we had this recently. I'm now in university administration, so I think about this stuff a lot, but we've had numerous examples of in recent, certainly after the election, right? Lots of faculty reaching out to us to ask our dean to make a statement about X, Y, or Z. And I think you're absolutely right, which is the job of university leadership is to say, my job is to represent this community, right? This community, the intellectual community. My job as a local government official to represent this community, not get what happens when you start making these resolutions is it not only fragments the community along those lines, so it undermines the community that you are supposed to be protecting as a local official and you're supposed to be serving as a local official, but it also undermines trust long term.
Yeah.
If you're an Israeli or a Palestinian citizen, you're not going to want to go to whoever that person is who just issued a resolution on one side or the other, because you're not right. If you're so, I just think that we miss the point. And I do think a lot of times people think it's the right thing to do in the moment.
Yeah.
And they need to think about these long-term impacts. So just use universities as like the canaries in the coal mine, because we did it wrong for 20 years. And now we're seeing the outcomes.
And it either feels good or you have people pushing you need to be on the right side of history.
Yeah.
We don't know history yet.
Yeah, I know. It's very hard. Yeah. We have about 3 minutes left. Laura, do you have any last questions that we didn't get to? I'm trying to look at our list.
We could have this conversation for several more hours.
3 hours.
Unfortunately,
I know.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. So yeah, I will save my questions for a future Shannon guest interview.
Yeah. I actually did have a question, and this might be like the space to end, which is, what do we think about the sort of marketing problem that like the middle moderation, like independent, obviously like algorithms don't like that. Like we don't, it's not flashy, it's not noisy. So I don't know if you can leave us on some hopeful, like, what are you feeling hopeful about in terms of how you can break through that noise, or like where you see the best levers for really giving people voices in this current environment?
I think the fact that this is not necessarily a really saturated space. The things that leave me hopeful are the people who are discovering, organization, your Substack and Laura's organization and my organization, discovering that it exists and saying, yes, like I've either been looking for this or I didn't know this existed or thank you, that kind of thing. And giving people an opportunity to engage in a political way, in a way that, it doesn't have to be about the fight. It doesn't have to be about the 100% ideological purity, and just letting them know that, yep, this exists. So there's not just this black hole in the middle. And then the other piece is giving people something to do.
Yeah.
So communicating that with legislators, with city councilors, with members of Congress, like the thank you for compromising email. If you have a legislator or a city councilor or somebody who has participated in one of these things and has said, oh, this is really hard, nobody's happy, everything. If you send them a thank you email, you will get a response, because they don't get these emails and they need to. And it shows how important that kind of communication is. And it's easy, it's low bar, is just communicating with your elected officials. And then you start a relationship there that will continue to have more communication. But that's the thing, like, it's easier to participate in a way that isn't joining the fight than a lot of people think. So, and that people seem to react pretty well to that. I know I react pretty well to that.
Yeah. I
love
love
that.
that. Yeah. I think that's a wonderful way to end. Any last words of wisdom, Laura, or anything else?
No, I love this. I think Shannon said like 8 things that I wrote down. I love that there's no such thing as a partisan pothole. I also I want to thank you for what you're doing, because it's really inspiring and energizing. And I think you make a lot of people feel like there's a place for them and they're understood and they could belong somewhere. And we need more of that. So I think it's fantastic. Like you summarized your work as like, you care about how people experience politics. And I just think that's such a fantastic mission. So thanks for sharing it with us.
Awesome. Absolutely. Thank you all for the work that you do and for the podcast. And I wind up listening along in the car and say, yes, right. Yay.
Yep. Thank you. So for our listeners, I'm going to ask Shannon to give us a couple book names. And then I have a couple, like anything that we mentioned in the podcast, we'll have on our show notes. So you can subscribe to We Made This Political on Substack to get all of those updates. We also upload the podcast with cleaned up audio and everything, usually on Mondays. So if you subscribe, you'll get all of those notifications. And we will also have Shannon's contact information, the website for her organization and all that good stuff on the website too, on that Substack. So subscribe if you want to keep in touch with Shannon, find out more about what she's doing and how you can help. Otherwise, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.